Player 2 is joining the game.
This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Every week on Hired, they run an auction where over 1,000 tech companies in San Francisco, New York, and LA bid on JavaScript developers, providing them with the salary and equity up front. The average JavaScript developer gets an average of 5 to 15 introductory offers and an average salary of over $130,000 a year. Users can either accept an offer and go right into interviewing with the company or deny them without any continuing obligations. It's totally free for users, and when you're hired, they also give you a $2,000 signing bonus as a thank you for using them. But if you use the Adventures in Angular link, you'll get a $4,000 bonus instead. Finally, if you're not looking for a job but know someone who is, you can refer them to Hired and get a $1,337 bonus if they accept a job. Go sign up at Hired.com/Adventures in Angular. Does your team need to master AngularJS? Oasis Digital offers Angular Bootcamp, a 3-day in-person workshop class for individuals or teams. Bring us to your site or send developers to ours, angularbootcamp.com. This episode is sponsored by Widmo5, a brand new generation of JavaScript controls. A pretty amazing line of HTML5 and JavaScript products for enterprise application development in that Widmo5 leverages ECMAScript 5 and each control ships with AngularJS directives. Check out the faster, lighter, and more mobile Widmo 5. This episode is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is the provider I use to host all of my creations. All the shows are hosted there, along with any other projects I come up with. Their user interface is simple and easy to use, their support is excellent, and their VPSs are backed on solid-state drives and are fast and responsive. Check them out at DigitalOcean.com. If you use the code AngularAdventures, you'll get a $10 credit. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 54 of the Adventures in Angular podcast. This week on our panel we have Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
Katya Eames.
Hello.
John Papa.
Hi.
I'm Charles Max Wood from DevChat.tv. We have a special guest this week, Minko Gechev.
Hello.
I know I said that poorly. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Minko. As you said, I'm a freelancer, and in my spare time, I love doing open source, blogging. I used to teach JavaScript and a few other disciplines in Sofia University and organizing some community events here in Sofia, Bulgaria.
Awesome.
Basically that's it. And I have some interest in computer science, software engineering, not only the practical side, but also the theoretical.
What community events do you organize?
Sofia.js, and I found out that it's easier to organize beer.js, actually. You invite people to a bar, you find a company to buy beer, and it's just much easier, much simpler, and people are happier.
Cool. So I have to ask, what time is it in Bulgaria?
It's around midnight.
Wow, that's dedication. It's just after
Whatever,
2
his
p.m.
day's probably just getting started.
Utah, yeah.
He's a programmer.
Yeah.
Still got a good 4 more hours before it's time for bed.
That's right.
Yeah, just finished my coffee.
Yeah, Monday night I started working on a problem at 1:30 in the afternoon and got done at 6:30 in the morning the next day. So,
Holy cow.
yeah.
Was it no fun or was it like awesome? Because
No,
it can be, it's one or the other.
It was no fun.
Oh.
It was kind of an emergency deal, so.
And I knew this guy, and the newest version of, this is back in the day, I'm going to date myself here, Fox Pro, right? Visual Fox Pro just released, and I remember the dude stayed up for like 48 hours because he was so entranced.
You know, that's a really interesting story, Joe, but why are you dating yourself?
Oh, dear.
Oh, gosh. Moving right along.
Yeah, so the topic today is immutability in Angular. Do you want to kind of give us some idea of where you would go with that and why it's useful to think about it?
Okay. And before you do that, would you mind explaining for everybody who may not know what is immutability?
All right, sure. Immutability, it sounds super unpractical initially, I believe so, because you're creating an instance of a data structure which you cannot change, you cannot mutate over time. So you're creating a list of developers, for example, and you cannot append new developers to the list. Basically, the concept comes from the purely functional programming languages, and it has broad applications in the modern front-end web development, I believe.
Yeah.
Now, do you mean that the data structure is immutable, or do you mean that the data itself in that structure is immutable?
The data structure is immutable. And well, we can, if this data structure is immutable and the items inside it they could be immutable too, but in our case, we're going to talk only about the immutable data structures with eventually mutable items.
Now, could you explain kind of like why is this big thing? So this is a topic that a lot of technologies are focusing on lately, it seems. So why is immutability something that particularly is interesting to Angular developers?
Right. Well, I can tell you how I decided to bring immutability to Angular 1. Initially, it started by working on React projects. Maybe saying React in Angular podcast is a dirty word.
We'll forgive you.
No, not at all.
We've already cut you off. It's already canceled.
All right. So I started working on React projects like maybe a year ago. And I really like the way they compose the user interface into different components. And I also like functional programming languages. In my spare time, I do some Haskell. So I started thinking about these components as functions because basically they can accept some input and they give you an output. Basically, that's what a function is. And the output is basically the rendered UI. So if you start thinking about these components as function, it's much easier to get this abstraction. And you can go one level above this. You can start thinking about these components as pure functions. Basically, functions which do not produce any side effects, which do not modify any global mutable state or anything. They just receive their inputs, do some computations, and produce an output.
And that's what a pure function is?
Well, there are two things which a pure function should do. It should not produce any side effects, and each time which the function is called with the same set of arguments, with the same values, it should produce the same result. So
sounds like a basis for unit testing too, huh?
Yeah, it's perfect for unit testing as well, because you don't have to handle any mutable state, global mutable state at all. And in React, basically we have this method called should component update, which is called each time something changes. And basically if you have this pure function and this function accepts some input, and this input are the properties, basically. So you can decide whether the component should update only by comparing the previous input of the function with the current one. And of course, if this input is different, so if you need to perform a deep equality check. And if this input is different, then the component should re-render itself. That's with mutable data. But here the immutable data comes. So when you create an immutable data structure, it cannot be changed. So when you try to modify it, this will lead to creation of a new immutable data structure with the modification applied, with the mutation applied to it. So you can decide whether the input parameters of the component has changed only by comparing references, right? And this makes the should component update method much faster. And I thought, well, maybe if you can take advantage of this in React, maybe it makes sense to apply the same thing in Angular 1 for speeding up the digest loop. So because the digest loop does something a bit similar, on each iteration of the digest loop, it takes all watched expressions, it evaluates their values in the appropriate context. And after that, on the next iteration, it just does the same by comparing the current results of the evaluated expressions with the previous results. And if you're using, for example, watch, and the third argument of the watch method for adding such listeners is true, you're going to perform a deep check. But if you're using immutable data, you can only perform a reference check, and this is going to speed up your digest quite a lot. That's why I decided that it might be useful in Angular 1.
So you mentioned side effects a while back. Can you explain what those are and like what some examples of them are?
Right. So a side effect, this is more related to the advantage you can take of the immutable data structures in Angular 2 or React. But basically, if we are talking about Angular 2, let's start talking about React now. So if we start talking about Angular 2, and a given component performs a side effect, this could be, for example, modifying some global variable or just using mutable data And one component this way can modify the parameters passed to different components by owning reference to the data used by the different the other component. And these are two examples of side effects.
And so why is that such a bad thing?
In the case of Angular 2, it's quite a bad thing because you can't decide when you need to re-render your UI. So, well,
and that's a bad thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. It can make the performance of your app much poorer.
Right, like in Angular 1, for example, if you make any change, it has to go once through the digest and calculate the changes, then it has to go a second time and look at all the data again and make sure that none of the data changed because of the first change that happened, right? So it always has to do 2 passes, right?
Yeah, that's true as well. And also the way you compare the data, if you are not using immutable data structures, it is much slower because you need to perform a deep check. Although when you're using immutable data structures, you can perform only a reference check. You only can compare the current reference of you can check whether the current reference of the result of the expression is equals to the previous one.
And that's because changes occur by creating a new object.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I thought that this is maybe not the most efficient way to speed up your digests. The immutable data structures, well, they have some overhead, and first of all, we're not completely taking advantage of all the features all the good things which the immutable data structures provide us. And second of all, well, it seems like a hacky solution to speed up your digests by creating a new reference to. And this seems quite unpractical. So I decided to try something different in Angular 1. And it was to make it possible to compare only a few fields of this data structure in order to verify that it's different from the data structure gotten from the previous evaluation of the digest loop. And, I dug a little bit deeper into the implementation of the digest method and saw that this is quite possible. So I created a better solution for Angular 1, which does not use immutable data structures.
Now, aren't immutable data structures kind of at conflict with large quantities of data? Like if you say you have a big list and you need to add one item to the list, isn't there sort of a fight between the fact that it's easy to compare and understand that, hey, this list has changed because the reference is now different, but on the other hand, to create the new data structure, which is a copy of the old one, which is already big, to copy all those elements and then then add the other new element when you create the new data structure. How does that work?
Yeah, in Angular 1, it's unpractical. You're correct on this. But the way, for my tests, I used Immutable.js, and they're using some smarter way for implementing immutable data structures. They're not copying the entire list in the case you suggested. They're not copying the entire list. They're using something called persistent data structures, which are, we can think of them as smarter way for implementing immutable data structures. So they're not copying the entire list. They're running some complex algorithms in order to achieve the same effect. And on the other side, it is much cheaper to create, even if you are creating an entirely new data structure, it is much cheaper to create it compared to the other option, which is to re-render your entire UI.
So let's compare that a little bit to a scenario, because I kind of following where Joe is going. Let's say we're in the UI and we have a list of results, and somebody, let's say 2 new items need to be appeared through sockets connection or through a rerun or a filter. If we use a immutable data structure, from hearing you correctly, we would throw away the 100 objects that we had in there in that list, and then we would re-render a new list that had the 102 in there. Is that what you're saying? Well,
not exactly, because here the persistent data structures come into play, because they're a way to do this in an optimized way. There are some very interesting lectures on OpenCourseWare by MIT, which could be checked out. They introduced persistent data structures and different ways for implementation. And can
we get you to give us links to that we could put in the show notes?
Yeah, sure. And exactly one of these ways for implementing persistent data structures is used in Immutable.js. But yeah, you have some performance overhead when you change given immutable data structures, because you need to maintain these persistent data structures in order to get the appropriate result. And still, I believe, so you need to perform for sure application-specific benchmarks in order to verify that this overhead is worth it.
So you had said that it's faster to do that, to create the new data structure, even if you are copying data, than it is to re-render your whole UI. So can you explain how it is that, let's take John's example. I've got 100 items. I add 2 more for some reason. Now I've got 102. How is it that when I change that data structure to a new reference, I don't end up needing to re-render all 102 new items, or 102 items is new, and I know that just the 2 that were new are actually new, and that's all that gets adjusted when we re-render?
This depends on how you have decomposed your components. Maybe you have some component which is called, for example, lists, and you have item components which are child components of the list. If you pass a new reference to the list, basically it is going to require re-rendering of itself, and it is going to pass the separate items to the list items it owns. Most likely you're going to end up only with rendering of the 2 new items, not with the rest. How much were they? 100?
Mm-hmm. So kind of getting back to in that same example, kind of getting back to Angular specifically, or Angular 1, how does the track by syntax help you or affect this in any way?
Well, in Angular 1, I don't think we can apply exactly the same strategy. In Angular 1, my optimization was mostly connected with a way to optimize the digest loop only by comparing references rather than doing deep query check, or shallow check with watch collection. So, what was your question again? Sorry.
So, like today, let's say we're not using immutable data for now. One possible scenario we could do alive is if we did have like 100 rows of data, like 10 columns each. Well, that could be slow sometimes when we're modifying one row or adding one new one somewhere. So one of the things they introduced, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, was like Angular 1.3 maybe?
Yeah.
1.2? Where they had the track by on the ng repeat, which would effectively, as long as you gave the ID that it was tracking by, it'd say, hey, look, those elements in the DOM shouldn't change. Leave them alone, only add or remove the ones that don't match, which was a significant UI performance increase. Now, that's not immutable data structures. That's, helping the DOM render where things are going. But I'm wondering if there's some combination of using immutable data structures and that kind of a strategy, the track by strategy, that could really help improve performance.
Yeah, I haven't got deeper into this algorithm. I think it's implemented in ng-repeat. You will have troubles using ng-repeat with immutable data structures. So you cannot use ng-repeat with immutable data structures at all because, well, the immutable data structures are not something which ng-repeat knows about. And I haven't done profiling using track by immutable data, so I can't state my opinion on this. Right.
And I'm just kind of push the envelope a little bit and think about, what are some of the biggest common issues we have with large data structures? It's not usually just one large data structure. Usually it's a list, and the most common places those appear are in loops, obviously. And so I was just wondering if you had seen or thought about anything that could track both not the data structure performance but also the DOM rendering.
Mm-hmm. I saw that in Angular 2 they are doing some pretty awesome things with with pipes there. They have special pipe for optimization of exactly iterating over large data structures. So this could be an interesting read just to scan their implementation of the.
Sounds like we've got a great topic to ask one of the Angular team members later too, to see if something maybe could be extended there.
Yeah, sure.
So can we talk a little bit more about Angular 2 and immutable data and how well immutable data works with Angular 2?
Yeah. Well, so I was inspired to talk about Angular 2 when I saw the notes after the meetup between the React teams and the Angular teams. In this meetup, in the notes, I saw that the Angular team is going to implement some support of immutable data structures in the core of the framework, which was fun. So I exchanged some emails with Victor from the core team, and really they have some awesome plans there. Basically, this is the same concept. So we can think about the Angular 2 components as pure functions the same way we thought about them in React components. And well, if we know that this component accepts some input and with the same input, it always returns the same output, we don't need to re-render this component if we pass the same parameters to it. Basically, we are sure that we're going to have the same output by the component, basically the same DOM, so we don't need to re-render it or anything. We just can skip the entire subtree, component subtree.
Interesting. So do you think that we're going to see a lot bigger adoption of immutable data once Angular 2 comes out?
Yeah, for sure. Victor has some awesome blog posts about using observables and immutable data structures in Angular 2. I already saw that RxJS is in the core, so you need RxJS, you need observables in order to, you can use observables in Angular 2. And probably next couple of months we're going to see immutable JS as well, but I can't be sure on this. I don't have any additional information. But most likely, because you have huge performance benefits, they reduce the number of digest iterations to only one by making the entire dirty checking, by making Angular 2 only with unidirectional data flow. So they remove the additional runs of the digest loop, and the only way to increase performance even further is just to not perform this digest at all. And it is possible to reduce it by using immutable data structures.
So you mentioned observables. Can you kind of talk about the relationship between immutable data and observables? We're seeing both of those things a lot now in these newer frameworks being talked about.
Well, I don't see much big relation between them, or I haven't thought about this. Maybe if I see some, so they are closer to promises and callbacks, but with immutable data structures, you just can simply build more functional UI, which is actually the same for observables. There is a nice library called CycleJS, which takes advantage of these concepts. And so I can add it into the picks as well.
Observables are interesting, right? Because one of the first earlier SPA frameworks that was out there, which did data binding and templating and all that, and it's still pretty active, is Knockout.js. And a lot of that was based upon the concept of observability. And obviously that's not something that's built into the language, but it's curious that things have kind of come full circle going back to observables, even though they're now more native in the ES6. Do you see more frameworks heading towards observables in the future to kind of support these kind of concepts?
Or are they heading towards observables and immutability, or one or the other?
Yeah, most likely. Basically, observables, there's in basically the entire observer pattern. It is in core of MVC and each MV whatever framework. They got very popular recently, but I believe we've used them, maybe not with the extension which RxJS introduced, but we've used them last couple of years without giving that much attention to them.
So what's interesting to me, too, is that with everything, there's a cost, right? There is no, hey, this is a better way, and there is nothing about it that makes you lose anything. At least in technology, it always seems. And always it's you weigh the pros and the cons. But the thing with observability, I always liked it, but the one thing I really liked about Angular, the digest cycle in one, is that we had no worries about setting up special property setters and getters to figure out how to observe our properties. We could literally just take a raw JSON object, map it into a JavaScript, set a code in a controller, and we could bind it up to a view, and bam, we've got data binding, we've got all sorts of stuff going on. With observability, we now have to monitor and watch and observe, literally, those kinds of properties. Do you see any similar things in immutability that we talked about the positive sides of it, but are there any cons that we have to be aware of with immutability, or maybe not cons, but anything we just have to be careful of?
It's got to be the same drawback, right? Like you can't just take any raw JSON and it's now immutable, right? You have to put it inside of a special immutable data structure. Is that true?
Yeah, or you can freeze it with ECMAScript 5 syntax, object.freeze.
Is that enough? Is it simply enough to just use object freeze? I mean, if so, then why do we have immutable JS and all these other tools?
No, I wouldn't say that. It's exactly the same. I think the biggest drawback of using immutables is exactly maintaining the persistent data structures, the overhead of creating the new objects, which is you need just to do some application-specific benchmarks in order to verify that using immutable data is the best thing for your application or not. I did a lot of benchmarks for this, and it turned out that in Angular 1, using immutable data structures, it's actually not the best thing you can do when you have collections below 500 items, for example. So, yeah, there is some performance overhead, and you need to be aware of it.
So if people want to start playing with immutable data in Angular 1, are there good places for them to get started?
Yeah, I have 3 blog posts for Angular 1 and immutable data structures. I did a lot of benchmarks using BenchPress, and I published my research at my blog. However, yeah, they can take advantage of immutable data structures in Angular 1, and they have to be careful how exactly they are doing this and do some application-specific benchmarks, as I said, because Angular 1 does not have also support of these immutable data structures out of the box. So I created a few additional libraries in order to fix this. But I would recommend to play with immutable data structures with more component-based UI, just like what React and Angular 2 provide us.
Are there good examples of this with Angular 2 then, that people can actually go and explore and play with?
Victor has good blog posts on this topic. I haven't seen any sample applications with this, but yeah, it is a nice weekend project.
All right, we'll see if we can get links to those in the show notes.
Yep, sure.
So what's your background with immutability, and how did you get into it?
All right, so first I started learning Haskell maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and that was the first place I saw what the immutable data structures are. I don't think I really understood how we can take advantage of them. I only knew that it is a purely functional language. You cannot change anything, and then the data structure should be immutable as well. But a few months ago, when I started working on my React user interface, I saw that it might be useful to apply the same techniques in Angular 1. And I came up with this idea also because I dug deeper into the Angular 1's implementation and saw how exactly the digest loop runs. I built my very simplified version of Angular in order to make sure that I know how everything wires up together. And that was the moment when I saw, maybe using immutable data structures makes sense in some cases. And yeah, that's it. That's the long story short.
Now, immutability has been around for a long time. And I know that like years ago, we saw immutability start making its way into languages like Java and C#. And now it's becoming a popular topic in JavaScript. Do you think that's because a lot of people are coming from those worlds into JavaScript and bringing it over? Or is it a reflection of the fact that people are realizing, hey, we want to push things beyond what they can do and we need new ideas?
Mm-hmm. In Java and C#, you can take advantage of the immutable data structures because they are very friendly for concurrent programming. In multi-threaded environment, it is good to have immutable data because you cannot have any inconsistent state of the data structures because basically you cannot change them. In Angular 2 and in the modern web UI, I see how we can take advantage of them in a different way, more like the way we use them in the functional programming in order to build a functional user interface, which we can easier reason about and test, and also increase the performance by using different framework-specific techniques.
Can you explain that a little bit better, that concept of functional user interface?
I'm not completely sure that everyone uses this term for what I'm talking about, but this is the same thing while thinking about your components as functions as pure functions, which accept the input and return the output when they are called with the same input.
So what are the inputs and what are the outputs then?
For example, in the list example, the list component will accept list of items, and it is going to pass each list item to the item child component. And none of these components has any internal state. It only accepts the input and returns the output. Just stateless components.
Yeah, I hear people, when I read about React and mess around with React, I hear people talking about viewing React as functional in that the data goes in and the UI comes out, right? And so you can imagine anytime you change the data, now the UI has changed, but it's a very one-way thing. Data in, UI out, whereas other MVC frameworks, Angular is a great example of this, we think of the UI and the data as this sort of circular. The data changes the UI, then the UI takes actions and it changes the data, and back and forth in a circle. Is this different thought process of UI, data goes in and UI comes out and it doesn't make a loop, which is a kind of Flux kind of embodies this whole idea, right? Is this something that is important to understanding and dealing with immutable data when it comes to these front-end MVC frameworks?
Yeah, you can use the same. So basically we're talking about Flux and MVC, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in Flux, it's not mandatory to use immutable data structures, at least there is a broad definition of what Flux is. According to my implementation, it's not strictly necessary to use immutable data structures. However, I've seen a lot of benefits from using these data structures because of the reasons of improved performance and easier testing. However, I definitely like this unidirectional data flow. There are a lot of projects there are a lot of people who are applying the same strategy in Angular 1 even. And there is going to be such a talk on Angular Connects, I believe, which is going to be super fun. Also, Victor, again, from the core team, he wrote a blog post how we can use Flux in Angular 1 projects.
Interesting. I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah, well, it's fun, and I had a lot of troubles by dealing with this cascading updates when you have MVC. The view throws, well, not exactly, let's do not talk about exactly about Angular 1, but about MVC in general. Just the model throws an event, the view captures it, the view throws an event for change of the model captures it, and just a wild loop with throwing just random events, which can get quite messy sometimes. That's why I'm using Flux recently, and I'm just exploring it and taking advantage of its simplicity.
Cool. Are there any other interesting points that we haven't covered in the topic?
I think we already said that there is no built-in support for immutability in Angular 1.
Right. Is immutable JS, is that like the library to use if you want to start learning and dealing with immutability inside of JavaScript?
Yeah, pretty much. I think so.
Nothing's as good as an endorsement as if you've got some awesome, use case or whatever. So I know I go in to try to sell ideas, and first thing people say is, that sounds awesome. Is there somebody already doing that? And can I see, the case study or just an explanation of how that helped them? With kind of using immutable data structures, do you have any examples of places you've used this that are kind of like the hallmark of this made an impact by doing X, Y, Z?
Yeah, based on the benchmarks I did in the series of blog posts I covered, you can reason about your applications if you have the same environment as in the benchmarks using huge collections and intensive digest loop iterations. You can definitely take advantage of the immutable data structures. And in Flux, I haven't actually seen in any directional data flow. In Flux, I mean in Angular 2 is included in the picture as well. I haven't seen any use case, not use cases, but any case studies of the topic. However, the testability is definitely getting much easier when using immutable data because you don't produce any side effects.
So what kind of applications have you used this in that's kind of benefited personally?
Well, just building a complex user interface, single page application where you need to, which is actually quite heavy and it needs to be optimized for performance. And also you need to have some stable architecture, which is able to evolve in future.
Are these like externally facing applications that Respos you've created and done this with, or are these internally like more line of business type internal apps, or can you kind of describe what kind of applications might be ideal for this?
I think that any applications with complex user interface, like a lot of components composed together, like
a to-do app?
Exactly.
The perfect, most complex app you could possibly build.
Yeah, to-do app or either something like with conference communications and chat insights and also some, let's say, to-dos and things like that. Basically, a lot of components which use a lot of data and trying to optimize the user's experience for this to optimize the performance of the application. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks.
Let's do it. We like
All right.
picks.
Katya, do you have some picks for us?
The Little Mermaid. I got to go see it performed at Hale Center yesterday, and it was amazing.
So the play.
Yeah, we play Little Mermaid.
Awesome.
I love Disney stuff.
Doesn't everyone?
I know, right? Joe, do you have a pick for us?
Yeah. So I'll also pick The Little Mermaid. I enjoyed watching it. There's some new songs in there, one of which I thought was actually really, really a good song. So I will definitely pick The Little Mermaid as well, the play version of Little Mermaid. I also want to mention that I'm going to be doing some training for Primitive IO. It's going to be a 2-day remote classroom, small classroom training on Angular. So if you're looking to level up your Angular skills, it's a great way to do it. I'm excited to do some classroom type training instead of big, large group training, So only having, less than 20-ish people in a virtual room to talk to. So you can register on Primitive IO, and I think they're giving a big discount for right now. We'll be doing it in September. So I'm excited for that. And those are my picks. So I guess I'm picking me. I pick myself. Pick me.
Yep. John, what are your picks?
So I've got a couple picks. For technology side, I want to pick Douglas Crawford has a great keynote called JavaScript, The Better Parts. It's basically a new keynote he's been putting together and using recently, and I got a chance to see it, and it's really awesome. It's a great. He talks about how he made the book originally and how it's taken off and been a bestseller for years. But more importantly, I feel like he's made some updates and some amends to some of the things he said, and it's something you got to check out. So check it out. We'll find out if it's up on YouTube or not. If it's not, definitely try to check out Douglas Crawford at the next event he's speaking at. And then from the non-technology side, I'm going to pick DuckTales. It's a TV show I watched when I was a kid, dating myself, Joe, like Joe is. And it's my son and daughter have been watching a lot lately. And it's just reminding me of a lot of things that I used to watch. And it's amazing how it's hasn't aged because they're still completely immersed in what this thing is. And then finally, I'll pick Pluralsight is doing a summer campfire, I think they're calling it. Is that right, Joe?
I have no idea.
It's
I saw something about it. It looked kind of cool.
Yeah, I hadn't really been paying attention. I do write for them, but yeah, I kind of tuned out for a while because I was busy at work, and I looked up, and it's been going crazy lately. They're actually giving away like a couple dozen of their courses all summer long in some kind of contest. And
I can't remember what they called it. Is it called Campfire? Is that what they called it?
Something like Summer Campfire or American Pie 4. I don't know which one it was.
Yeah, it was something. But yeah, they're giving away like 30 different courses or something.
Camp Pluralsight.
Camp Pluralsight. Way to go. Chuck.
Yeah, I mean, and free learning is always good.
The guy who isn't the Pluralsight author is the one who identified what it was. Speaks well for John and I.
Yeah. That's. I guess we're persona non grata now.
Yeah, my Google skills are faster than yours.
What's Google?
I'm sorry, Lycos.
Get off my lawn.
Oh, man.
Oh, we had some guys talking about how old they were.
Yeah, Lycos. Wow. I mean, you didn't even go for something like Ask Jeeves. You went all the way. Yeah.
Alta Vista.
Alta Vista.
Yes,
I mean, at least that was a little bit more well known, but Lycos, wow, that's really way back there.
Yep. All right, I'm going to make a couple of picks here. I had to do some video recording for my sister's wedding on Saturday. Just recorded people at a reception and then, recorded her and her new husband, at the temple where they were married and stuff. And I got a couple of things that helped out. One is I got this clip that holds your iPhone or other smartphone in place, so you can use it as a camera on a tripod. And it worked really well, and it cost like $8. So if you're looking to do some videography and you're not doing big honking awesome camera stuff, then that'll work. The other thing that I got was a video stabilizer, and this is something that attaches to the bottom of your camera, just like a tripod does. And what it is it has counterweights on it so that you can hold on to the handle, and as you move it around, it keeps the camera smooth and steady. And it was pretty handy as well. It's kind of hard to describe what it looks like, but I'll put links in the show notes. And then if you're going to be doing some sort of freehand video shooting, then you can go check it out. And that was
like a Steadicam for your cell phone. I can just imagine you with a big harness on your hip, and at the end of this big long thing is a cell phone.
No, this thing it's all just in your hand. So there's nothing that, goes back to your core or anything like that.
Huh. Funny.
But anyway, it worked pretty well, and I was pretty happy with it. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Minko, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, sure. Yesterday I watched awesome talk by Minko Gechev, who talks about the relation between testability and good design. And so I want to share this pick with you. With enough imagination, you can see the topic of immutability in this talk.
Awesome. I'm a fan of Michael Feathers. Definitely good pick there. All right. Well, thank you for coming, Minko.
Thank you for having me.
If people want to follow up or see what you're about or anything like that, how do they do that?
I'm mostly active at GitHub and Twitter, so they can find me there.
All right, cool. Thanks again. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more. Do you want to have conversations with the Adventures in Angular crew and their guests? Do you want to support the show? Now you can. Go to adventuresinangular.com/forum and sign up today.